Our second reading is from the Gospel according to John's chapter 13. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. He poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash each other's feet. For I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And may God speak to us through these verses tonight. My friends, we know that farewells can be very sad and very difficult. No one enjoys saying goodbye to people we love, even if we know we may only be apart for a little while. But how much more it pains us when we know we are saying goodbye to someone for the last time, realizing we will never see them again. We have all probably experienced this kind of farewell at one time or another, in one form or another. There is sorrow. There is regret. Regret for things we have said or done. Regret for things we should have said or done. There is a sense of loss, of something being taken from us. And sometimes we might wonder how or even if we can pick ourselves up and go on. Farewells are occasions for dealing with things that really matter, important things. They're occasions for being honest and sincere with each other, for speaking from the heart, for not being afraid to let our emotions show, emotions that we don't always express. And sometimes we don't express them because we think there'll always be another chance. There's always another time. We also probably want our farewells to be memorable. If someone is going away from us, we want there to be some memory of our last time together that we can hold on to and treasure in our hearts. And if we are the one going away, we may hope that we can give something to the people we are leaving behind that they will always remember about us. There is no doubt that these were some of the issues and emotions that Jesus and his disciples were dealing with, gathered together in that little room, all of them knowing that very soon Jesus would be taken from them. In a few hours, he would be arrested, the next day executed, crucified on a cross. And in our reading from John's Gospel, we witness three things that Jesus thought were important enough to say and do on his last night on earth, things that he wanted his followers to understand and remember. Each of the four Gospels describes that last night somewhat differently. But they all agree on one thing. Jesus and his disciples ate a Last Supper together. So that was the first memorable thing he did that night. And we know that Jesus used meals together to bring people together in fellowship. One of the ancient images of God's kingdom was this huge banquet. The prophet Isaiah, for example, describes a future when people from every nation would come to God's holy mountain, where God will host a great feast that lasts forever. The book of Revelation says the same thing. Jesus used this image of God's banquet a lot, which is one reason why meals were so important to him. Meals that he ate with everyone, rich, poor, the religious leaders, but more often with the outcasts and the sinners. And that was his way of saying everyone was invited to God's banquet too. For Jesus, each meal was a kind of dress rehearsal for that great banquet that everyone is invited to. Each meal was a small taste of God's kingdom appearing then and there. And so it is no surprise that his farewell took the form of a meal with his closest friends. His followers were to follow his example and continue what he had done. And it's one way that we, too, are to remember Jesus, by practicing what he preached and sharing in those gifts of food and fellowship. The second memorable thing he did that night was to fetch a towel and water and kneel down to wash his disciples' feet. Now, all of them were probably pretty puzzled by this. They might have even whispered to each other, "What is he doing?" But only Peter speaks up, as Peter usually does. The Gospels use Peter as the voice of the church, and frequently the voice of a church that doesn't always understand Jesus. And Peter says, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus says, "You might not understand this now, but eventually you will." And Peter says, "No way, Lord, no way are you going to wash my feet." The reason this would have seemed strange and embarrassing to them was that foot washing was the job of a slave. You know, back then, everybody wore sandals or they went barefoot. They were walking very dusty roads. Their feet got pretty dirty. So they hired slaves to wash feet before people would come into the house. It was one of the lowest, most demeaning jobs around. And no one respected a foot washer. But here's Jesus, their teacher, their leader, their Messiah, they believed, humbling himself to do this lowly job. "Peter, if I do not wash you, you are not really with me," he says. And he explains that he is setting an example for his followers. Now, because of these verses, there are churches today, including Presbyterian, that often have a foot washing ceremony on Maundy Thursday. I don't think any of us wanted to do that, though, right? But I think it's fine that churches do that. But really, Jesus was just doing it as a symbol of who we are called to be. We are to serve one another with humility, just as Jesus did his whole life. Jesus is reminding us it is one thing to talk the talk, but another to actually walk that walk. And he's telling us we are not to think so highly of ourselves that we think we are above kneeling down and getting our hands dirty now and then, helping each other. It's another way for us to remember Jesus and show that we too have a share in him. And he says we are blessed by doing it. And the third thing that Jesus did that night is tell his followers to love one another. He says, "That is how everyone will know if you are my disciples." That's a pretty simple test, isn't it? Nobody's asking us to recite the Apostles' Creed. Nobody's asking us to memorize Bible verses. Nobody's asking us how many times we go to church or how well we sing a hymn or what our church looks like. If you love one another. And of course, love in the language of the Gospels of that time, it's not an emotion or not just an emotion. It is active. It is what we do. It is how we live and how we treat one another. It is not simply emotionally caring for someone. Now, this verse from the Gospel was the inspiration for a very well-known song that we're going to sing later that includes the line, "We will walk with each other, we will walk hand in hand, and together we'll spread the news that God is in our land. And they'll know we are Christians by our love." By our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. That's a hard image to live up to. We all know that. And maybe the reason that Jesus preached so much about love is because he knew how difficult it is and how easily we forget. We forget that love is what makes us most like God. In fact, everything Jesus said and did, and the things that he emphasized most in his farewell, the fellowship meal, the humble service of foot washing, it all centers on love. Expressions of love that we are to embody. According to Jesus, the only proof we have that we are truly his followers, as I said, has nothing to do with creeds or theology or the number of hours we spend in church or in our Bibles, but rather the proof is our love for our fellow human beings. And as I've said many times before and will say many more times, that's the only kind of proof that other people are paying attention to. Fellowship, humble service, love. These are what our faith is really about. And in a way, they are not separate things, they're one thing. And if Jesus thought they were important enough to make them part of his farewell, part of what he wanted his followers and friends to remember most and to treasure in their hearts, then surely they are what he would want us to remember and treasure as well. Amen.